Welcome to a Foreman Deep Dive. I'm taking this week's on the subject of software collections and how we're going to change our RPM software collections implementation, hopefully in Foreman 1.9 from Ruby 193 to our own Foreman software collection. This is going to be mostly a presentation, so you should now be able to see the slides. I'll show you how the software collections work currently and how they will work. I will try and check for questions throughout, so submit those via the Q&A app on YouTube or Google Plus page. And I will also try and monitor IRC. The talk's going to require some level of familiarity with RPM packaging and RPM builds. I'll introduce software collections themselves. So we're going to start with an introduction to software collections, how they're used in the landscape, how they're published, how they work, and how we layer multiple SCLs on top of each other, how we package new software collections, and how this is going to look in Foreman 1.9. So software collections are a packaging technology, and the term is overloaded a little, so I'll just explain this. Software collections are a way implemented RPMs to install additional versions of a piece of software alongside defaults. So you can have, for example, the default version of Python on EL6 plus additional versions of Python installed alongside. And the key point is that they won't interfere with the system version, and that users and applications that want to use software collections can opt in to activate the collection. So by default, you'll be using, say, Python 2.6 from system packages, and you can perhaps opt in to use Python 3.3. You can also, there are many instances of software collections that are published and distributed, primarily by Red Hat, which I'll go into a little. However, there is the technology of software collections, and there are actual instances of the collections. The term software collections depends on the context, really. Primarily the language runtime, so Ruby being the obvious example, Python, PHP, and Perl as other examples. There are also multiple compilers, so GCC and development tools such as Git, and also daemons and services like Apache, Postgres, and MariaDB. Any application can really be packaged as a software collection if it can be packaged as an RPM. So looking at what's out there today, we have the tooling at the bottom. This is the software collections tools that help you build, help you install, and activate collections. So this is focused around SCL utils, which is a package providing, say, RPM macros for building, utilities for activating collections and managing collections. There's also spec to SCL, which is a development tool for converting RPM spec files to a software collection enabled spec file. On top of this tooling, and the tooling's in the distros, we have additional distributions of collections themselves. So we have development environments, such as developer toolset. That's a Red Hat product that's also been rebuilt by Scientific Linux. That ships things like Git, things like GCC, and other development tools. And we have runtime environments that we use in Foreman. This is Red Hat software collections. So this is versions of Ruby, versions of Python, daemons, and server components. There's also a website, softwarecollections.org, that is a place for third parties to publish collections, so publish applications that they've packaged into a standalone collection, and it acts as an index for third-party collections. So Foreman is based on Red Hat software collections, which was released a couple of years ago now, and early versions of Foreman, I think it was 1.2 and 1.3, shipped basically an alpha version of RHSCL 1.0. So you'll see this in our repos. You'll actually find the old binary RPMs. We're now up to version 1.2 with a major version on the horizon, and it's gained additional collections, additional languages, newer versions of languages, and it does primarily focus on script runtimes, daemons, and web servers. So Python, PHP, Perl, that sort of thing, MongoDB, MariaDB, and Postgres. And for us, Ruby on Rails, newer version of Apache, and Nginx. So an interesting point is that it's also compatible across major enterprise Linux releases. So the collections that are published for Rails 6 are also available for Rails 7. And we use this in Foreman. So we use Ruby 193 on EL6 and Ruby 193 on EL7. So it gives a standard base across both. It has been rebuilt numerous times, so it's in all of the EL rebuilds, although it can lag a little compared to the upstream. And it's also built onto softwarecollections.org by the RHSCL maintainers. So binary RPMs are available from both those sources. And when you're installing Foreman, we currently use softwarecollections.org as our canonical location for binaries. If you're installing onto RHEL, then you get Red Hat distributed binaries instead. So here's an example of what's in RHSCL 1.1. I put this table together last year, so it's a little out of date. But you can see the types of languages, types of database servers down the left-hand side. You can see a comparison of EL6 here. So picking Python as an example, we've got 2.6 in EL6. And RHSCL 1.1 shipped 2.7 and 3.3 in addition to the base OS version. Fedora 20 has very similar versions, and you'll see much of RHSCL matches what's in a Fedora release. And again, at the time of writing, this is, I think, summer last year, 2014, many of the versions are quite close to the upstream versions too. An interesting point about RHSCL for Foreman is it not only ships Ruby, but it also ships Ruby on Rails. So the Ruby 193 collection that we rely on in Foreman today ships Ruby 1.9.3, but in the same collection, it adds Ruby on Rails. This is the web framework we use to build Foreman. So we have 3.2 and we have 4.0 available too. So just to show you how this looks on a very simple installation, I'm going to go to softwarecollections.org and just going to install a Python collection. Just get out of the Ruby mindset a little. So on here we have Yum repositories that are available. Install Rails 6 version. Just install the release package. So this is configured repositories for softwarecollections.org. And I can just install all of the packages inside the collection by running yum install python 3.3. As you can see here, all of the packages within the collection have a Python 3.3 prefix. And there are a couple of extra packages like Python runtime, Python 3.3 Python, Python 3.3. And those are the sort of metadata around the collection that allows you to activate it. So once the collection's installed, we can enable it like this. This actually is. Oops. Quote it. Let's go back. So Python -v, we have Python 3.3.2 that comes from the collection, or if we're using the base OS version, we have Python 2.6.6. So this is unrelated to etc alternatives. We still have the user bin Python that points at Python 2.6, but separately, if I can find it, we have a new binary under opt rh Python 3.3 under /opt. When we run SCL enable, we activate that different path, and we're calling that binary instead. So it has no effect on user bin, the default path, or any packages that are compiled against the stock Python version. I'll find the window again. So we saw the prefix just now. Every software collection has its own name that usually includes the version of the software. And this allows you to install multiple versions, multiple software collections for the same package. So we have Ruby 193, Ruby 2.0.0 that can be installed alongside each other. Recent packages also are gaining a vendor prefix, so you'll begin to see RH-collection for Red Hat distributed collections. And this is stored under opt, the vendor prefix, and then the name of the collection itself. So opt RH Ruby 193, opt RH, opt IBM, for example. The Python 3.3 RPM that I installed comes from a top-level source RPM, and this contains the meta package for Python 3.3 that installs everything inside the collection. It contains a runtime package that installs the directory structure and has metadata so the collection can be activated. And there are two build-related packages, one for building packages within the collection and one for building collections based on that collection. So those are development packages. So spec files for collections look much like the originals, but with additional tags. So dependencies, instead of just referencing Python now, need to have a prefix attached. So we have SCL prefix throughout spec files. This expands the dependency to be Python 3.3 -Python whatever. Existing macros like binder, which usually expands to user bin, expand to the software collection version instead. So we now have opt RH Python 3.3 root user bin for binder. And that allows much of the magic in a spec file to carry on into the software collection version. There is a script deployed by the runtime RPM called enable, and this does the magic of changing the current working environment to load the libraries and load the binaries from the /opt path. So when you run SCL enable with the collection name, it sources the enable script that's been deployed by the collection, and that sets up the environment variables to load libraries and binaries from /opt. And this is preferred over the system version. So it's very much a runtime and small build time change. In the Foreman itself, we have a Foreman package, which is actually installed under the root directory. It's not part of a software collection, but it depends on the Ruby 193 collection. As you'll see today, if you yum install Foreman, you get user share Foreman /apt/lib and all the other files that are part of the source installation. We then install a number of dependencies that come from the Ruby 193 collection. That comes from RHSCL for the rebuild. And it includes Ruby itself, Ruby 1.93. This includes Ruby on Rails 3.2. And all of these are installed under opt RH Ruby 193 as stock packages. We then have a number of additional packages that a Foreman project has built These have the same Ruby 193 prefix, such as deface. They come from our repositories, but they install in the same path, opt rh Ruby 193. They're pretty indistinguishable from the Rails packages, unless you look at the RPM metadata. We also install a couple of binaries under user bin, short scripts that we can use in shebang lines and in passenger configs to activate the collection. So that way, when passenger tries to launch Ruby, to launch Foreman, it runs the SCL enable Ruby 193 and a V8 collection, which is a JavaScript library. And that way, Ruby, Rails, and all of the dependencies we've shipped under /opt are used instead of the stock Ruby version. You can do this from a command line as well with SCL enable Ruby 193 V8 314. So that's how it is today. RHSCL 1.1 added a neat feature which allows us to create new software collections that use existing collections. So this means we can now SCL enable Foreman, and it automatically enables any dependencies we've specified too. So RHSCL has a nice example for this now. Rails 4.0 was added to RHSCL, and it depends on Ruby 2.0.0. So now when you run SCL enable Ruby on Rails 4, it also activates the Ruby collection that Rails depends on. So you don't have to list all of the collections that you need, just the top level one. The use of Ruby 2.0, by the way, in Rails 4, it's not a requirement of Rails 4 as such, but it's the dependencies of the collection. It's explicit. And if we create a new collection, or a third party does, you can depend on multiple collections. So we could have, for example, a Foreman collection that depends on Ruby on Rails, on Ruby, on a newer version of Postgres, so Postgres 9, or MariaDB 5. So what I've been leading up to is a change to Foreman for how we package our extra dependencies. Instead of adding them to Ruby 193, I want to add them to a new TFM, the Foreman collection. The motivation for this has been coming with Rails 4. The work in that's already in progress, hopefully for Foreman 1.9. And to do this, we would already have to do a mass rebuild of our packages. So we've been moving from Ruby 193 to ROR 4.0, and that means renaming everything. That means renaming all of the packages that we ship, all of the dependencies in those packages to point to the right collections, and generally a lot of disruption. If we put our packages into a TFM package, a collection, then it gives us a bit of stability because we can change what the TFM collection depends on without changing all of our package names each time we add or change a dependency. We also had an instance with Ruby 193, I think there's for RHSCL 1.1, where a new package was added to the upstream collection. And we were shipping this package already in Foreman, and the two names would have conflicted. Unfortunately, our builds also weren't identical, so if a user had installed the newer package from RHSCL 1.1, it wouldn't have worked with Foreman because they were built differently. And currently, we have no elegant way to activate dependencies. So looking at the previous slide, to fully activate everything Foreman depends on today, you have to list two collections. If we wanted to add Postgres into our collection, then this line gets ever longer. Just check if there's any questions. So, packaging a new software collection is slightly easier now. It's quite well documented in the RHSCL documentation with examples. Actually, the example features Foreman, familiar enough. It involves creating just one new source RPM, called TFM in this instance, that supplies multiple binary RPMs, multiple subpackages. Inside the runtime package, we ship a script, an enable script, and this points the runtime at the new gem paths, so Ruby gems can load from the right directories, from the correct path, the correct LD library path, and so on. It also gives us an opportunity to roll in our user bin Ruby 193 binaries into that package, as it's part of the same thing, enabling SCLs. And we also have to change dependencies on all of our existing packages. So instead of depending today on Ruby 193 Ruby gem to face, we now need to depend on TFM Ruby 193 to face. TFM Ruby gem to face. Likewise, if we have a dependency in the Ruby collection itself, we need to use SCL prefix Ruby explicitly, so we get a Ruby 193 prefix. So we can't assume everything is now in the same collection. Upgrading is going to be perfectly possible, although it's currently untested. So we will be renaming packages. So in the face example, we simply change the prefix from Ruby 193 to TFM. And dependencies change similarly. So we have Ruby 193 deface that now becomes TFM Ruby gem deface. The Rails dependency comes from the Ruby 193 collection, so we keep the same prefix. We have RPM obsoletes in our spec files, so you upgrade to the TFM package and it will delete, or yum or DNF will delete our old Ruby 193 builds. In a couple of places we actually overwrite and ship newer versions of packages in the software collections themselves. We do this with sprockets today, so Ruby 193 ships a particular version of sprockets, and we ship a newer version. They have the same package names, but with our own collection, we would be shipping an additional package. So you'd perhaps have, if it's JSON as an example here as it came up the other day, Ruby 193 JSON, and you have TFM JSON. They'd both be installed, perhaps, depending on package dependencies. But when you're in the Foreman environment, because of the order in which we activate our collections, the order in which the paths are set up, we'd be preferring our newer TFM JSON. This also means that we don't affect applications built on the Ruby 193 stack. So in theory, you can install a Ruby 193 application alongside a Foreman application. So looking at how Foreman would be laid out after upgrades, we still have Foreman under user share Foreman. We still have Ruby 193 Ruby gem Rails from the Ruby 193 collection in opt.rh. But the face now has a TFM prefix, and it's now stored in opt dforeman/TFM. Similar layout, different vendor string and different collection name, but similar layout. We'd replace our Ruby 193-Ruby binaries with TFM Ruby binaries, and these would activate TFM, and TFM will in turn activate Ruby 193. SCL enable TFM works the same way, activates all of our dependent collections, Ruby 193, 38314, and whatever we choose to add in the future. So I'm now going to have a quick look at our spec files. I'm just going to answer Daniel's question first. So Daniel asks, does this mean that Jenkins will have to run on packages from TFM SCL before Rails 4 is merged? So I guess this talks about nightly packages mostly. We can merge Rails 4 into Foreman itself and do the packages shortly after, and simply not update our nightly repositories until we've got all the packaging sorted, or we can do it about the same time. I think we can probably merge Rails 4, begin to update the packages, and maybe have a working installation within a week or two again, and re-enable nightly builds. Daniel also asks how a person writing the packages specify that TFM takes precedence over Ruby 193. Let's take a look at that now. So this is the pull request. I'll just increase the font. I think I linked to it from the deep dive. Excellent, it's locked up. There we are. Bit of a large PR. So this is the TFM source RPM, and in here somewhere is the enable script. Right. So here inside the TFM source RPM is the enable script that we install in the runtime environment. The first thing our enable script does is it enables SCL Ruby and SCL V8. So those paths get added. But when we edit the paths ourselves to add the TFM directories in, we put them at the beginning of the paths. So Ruby gems will look through the gem path environment variable, and it's first going to find the TFM directories, then it's going to find the Ruby directories. The same thing happens for binaries and libraries too. So TFM is always preferred over Ruby 193. But if you're developing a Ruby 193 collection, TFM won't interfere. You'll always get the original Ruby 193 version after that. It's the same question. All right. So, as I said, this is the spec file for the top level TFM package. Let's have a look at this first. So we have the Foreman as a vendor, which is used under /opt. But I elected not to use that in the name, so we're trying to keep them short. At the moment, we build on top of Ruby 193 and V8 314, and we can change these, or we can change what's in the build routes when creating this package to build on a newer version of Ruby or a new version of V8. Most of this is boilerplate from the documentation, so I'm going to skip over it a bit. The layout is the same as other software collections, just some changes in descriptions. This is the enable scriptlet that gets installed under /opt for Foreman TFM. So it's setting up the paths and is called when we run TFM Ruby or we're doing SCL enable TFM, and changes the current working environment. We also create a few files that are used when we build packages within the TFM collection, or that could be used by people building on top of the Foreman collection. Various other standard files, changes, and that's pretty much it. It's quite a short spec file, just generating 4 or 5 binary packages. And we can also have it require the Ruby and the V8 collections. So when you install TFM, you also get all of those collections installed by default. If you want to see the binary of this, I've actually built it on Copper. Or you can just build the source RPM quite simply. So we can see we have TFM, binary, build, runtime, and SCL devel. And if we look at the top level package, we can see what it depends on. So we see when you install the TFM package, it installs Ruby 193 and V8 314, but otherwise it doesn't actually contain anything. The one that contains things is the runtime package. And this contains the standard layout for a software collection, basically without any files. The interesting one it does contain is the enable file. So if I just unpack that. This is the generated file from the RPM build. And you can see, just increase increase the font a little, so that we're adding opt, Foreman, TFM root to the beginning of all of our paths. So we'll always prefer TFM over any other collection, or indeed the system. So that's the base package. The other things in this PR are a mass conversion of all of the packages that we build to reference the correct collections. So fog core is quite a good example, I found. Bring that up. Try to increase the font size. So we can see all the standard dependencies for fog core are here. Some of them are changed to SCL prefix Ruby. So Ruby gems itself is provided by Ruby 193. SCL prefix Ruby is going to expand to Ruby 193, so we'll still require Ruby 193 Ruby gems. But XCOM, for example, is provided by TFM, so we require TFM-RubyGem XCOM. And so all of the dependencies we had to sort of categorize into coming from the Ruby package, coming from the V8 collection, or coming from TFM. And the same will happen when we move to Ruby on Rails 4, but some of them will be SCL prefix ROR, some will be SCL prefix Ruby, and some will still be SCL prefix. This was actually done using a script with just a lookup table, which is in here still. Just a lookup table of all of the packages and which collection they belong to. If I bring up fog core again, the other item you'll see here is an obsoletes line. So we're the only distributor of Ruby 193, RubyGem, fog core. So we obsolete that package and ensure that way it gets removed on upgrades. So I'm going to switch now to another virtual machine. Now this one has a mass rebuild of all of our packages as of about a month ago. So these have all been mass rebuilt to have TFM prefix. You should find them under here. You can see they all now have TFM prefix for their file names. If we actually go and find fog core, you should see we now have TFM prefixes for XCOM, as we saw in the spec file, but Ruby 193 prefixes for the Ruby dependencies. So you'll see when I do an upgrade at Foreman, we'll get the obsoletes that's listed in the spec files will cause all of the old Ruby 193 packages to be replaced. So RubyGem NetLDAP Ruby 103 was replaced by TFM RubyGem NetLDAP. And all this is coming from the rebuild repo. It's a straightforward upgrade of Foreman, some additional Ruby 193 dependencies, and some additional packages. So multi-JSON is provided in Ruby 193. We replaced it, and so we're now going to get TFM multi-JSON installed as well. Same with sprockets that I highlighted earlier. I'm not actually going to run that because I've yet to test it, but we've got that far so far. So all of those spec files are up on the pull request, which is linked from the event. Do have a look through. Improvements to the script are welcome too, but it seems to have done the job on the vast majority. Some of the remaining work to do, we can look at changing how we depend on TFM and perhaps versioning TFM so we have quite a strict relationship between Foreman versions and TFM versions. And this might give us a way to remove obsolete packages when we move from major versions, so users aren't left with many old versions of Ruby gems, which can slow down an installation. I mentioned that I want to move the user bin binaries for wrappers into TFN, which will remove another source RPM. We have a couple of things to update: SE Linux and the installer to know the new prefix and the new paths. I mentioned that I've elected not to use a vendor prefix so far, but I'm happy for comments on that. Red Hat are moving to an RH prefix, but we do have a lot of long RPM names, so reducing that will save our fingers. There's a failure to build on Passenger at the moment. There's also a new passenger collection that's in progress. There are some test RPMs up on the web for that. And so tying that in, which allows you to activate multiple versions of Ruby from Passenger to our collection, would be quite good too. And there's a small matter of running the Yum upgrade and testing it. So I'll check if there are any more questions through the Q&A app. Links are up here too. You'll find them on the invite. And please feel free to bring up questions on the mailing list or on the Foreman Dev IRC channel, or indeed on the pull request. So one last check. Nothing new. Okay, the recording will go up on the website as usual, and questions, comments are most welcome. Thank you.